all waiting to be let into the webinar?
Is it not letting you guys in yet?
No.
No, we got let in.
We're in now?
Yep, thanks.
Perfect. Yeah, sorry. Is it not letting you guys in yet?
I can't start my video,
We're in now?
Yep, thanks.
Amber.
Amanda, when you have a second, can you make me a co-host, please?
And Jordan, we are ready on YouTube and eScribe whenever you are.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to give us just another moment. We're still missing several people, and it looks like there's some members of the public and the applicant team that are filtering in right now as well. So we'll just wait just a couple minutes and then get started. For anyone just joining us, I'm going to wait just another minute or two to get started. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and call the Land Use and Planning Committee to order. Welcome, everyone. This is, of course, another virtual meeting, and we're meeting via the Zoom webinar platform. You can join this meeting if you're watching on YouTube or on Mcnet. You can join the live meeting by visiting ci.missoula.mt.us/webcasts. On that page, you'll find the Land Use and Planning Committee agenda and a link to join the meeting. If you're joining us by phone, you can press *9 on your phone if you wish to provide public comment, and that will indicate to me that you are interested in providing public comment, and I'll recognize you. If you're joining us in the Zoom platform, you can use the hand raise feature within Zoom. There are many other ways to comment, so you can provide comment on this item by calling the City Council voicemail line at 406-552-6012, or by emailing the council at council@ci.missoula.mt.us. With that, we can go ahead and move into our agenda items. And our first order of business, as always, is roll call. I'll go through the roll. Stacy Anderson is present. Mirta Becerra is present. John Contos is present. Heather Harp is present. Jordan Hess is present. Gwen Jones present. Julie Merritt is present. Jesse Ramos, Amber Sherrill, Sandra Vasica, Brian Van Lossberg, and Heidi West are all present. So all members are present. We have minutes. Do we have minutes? Sorry, I have a poverty of space. I normally have an extra monitor.
There are no minutes, Jordan.
There are no minutes. Okay, great. Thank you. And so we do have several members of the public here, and I suspect that everyone is here to comment on the Mcnet Flats subdivision proposal. So I'm going to call for public comment right now. This is just public comment on items not listed on the agenda. And if you have comments on the Mcnet Flats subdivision, we'll take those comments at a later time. So any comments on items not listed on the agenda? Seeing none, we can move into our regular agenda. And this is we have one item of business today. This is the Mcnet Flats major subdivision. Dave DeGrandpré and Emily Gluckin from the City of Missoula's Community Planning, Development, and Innovation Department are here. And I want to give a couple of notes on process first before I turn it over to Dave and Emily. This is a pre-public hearing item. So today, this is informational. We have about an hour and 15 minutes. That time is going to fly by. I intend to have this item back at the Land Use and Planning Committee next week. So today we're going to get through the staff report. We have the applicant here who will give a presentation. We have several members of the public who I imagine will provide comment. And we will have opportunity for council questions. And I want to make it clear to the applicants and to members of the public that this is a pre-public hearing today. So this is a fact-finding informational meeting. And so don't be surprised if council members reserve comments, because that's our duty today. We're still gathering information, and so nobody will be making any substantive comments in favor or in opposition to this project, because we're not at that phase yet. Later on Monday, February 22nd, we will have our public hearing on the annexation and subdivision, and finally, and then on February 24th, next Wednesday, we'll have a follow-up LUP meeting, and then finally on March 1st is when City Council will take action on the item that's on the annexation and subdivision items. So with that, I'll turn it over to our staff for the staff presentation.
All right, thanks, Jordan. Emily, are you ready to share the screen?
Yep, can you see it?
Yes. Okay, good afternoon, councilors, committee members. I'm Dave DeGrandpré. I'm here today with Emily Gluckin, Development Services, and we will talk about the Mcnet Flats annexation, zoning upon annexation and subdivision. Again, this is a pre-public hearing informational item. Next slide, please, Emily. So the property itself, I think you're all familiar with the neighborhood. This is in the Setuckane area, so north of Mullen Road, south of Broadway. There's been a lot of recent activity development-wise in this area. It's an area that's changing pretty rapidly. The subject property is 20 acres in size. You can see it on the screen. It's immediately to the east of the Remington Flats subdivision. That's a subdivision that you all granted preliminary approval to in the fall. It consists of 152 residential lots of single family, two family, and three family type dwellings. The Heron's Landing subdivision is located to the south of, well, immediately to the south of the property is Flynn Ranch and also 44 ranch subdivisions that have been developing over the past several years. South of that is Heron's Landing. That consists of 347 lots in several phases that are proposed to be developed out over the next probably 20 years. So anyway, it's an area that's changing pretty quickly. It's former agricultural land. The main thoroughfare, north-south road, is George Elmer Drive. That's a Mullen Build Project road. That's considered an urban collector and is planned to be extended through the property, straight up the middle to the north, extending to the north farther, and then eventually connecting with England Boulevard, which is another build grant road. Next slide, please. So in terms of process, there are a couple of moving parts here. There's annexation and initial zoning, and you may recall that on the 25th of January, council adopted a resolution of intent to annex the property and to zone it B2-2. We also have a subdivision, 7-lot subdivision that we'll be talking about here today. The planning board held a public hearing on the 2nd on the subdivision and recommended approval of the subdivision and several variances subject to 26 conditions. And we'll go through some of those. Although there was quite a bit of good, lively planning board discussion as well, and I'd like to touch on some of that. And attached to the eScribe documents, or included with the eScribe documents, there's a planning board summary, and then also quite detailed minutes that lay out the discussion. They're very well done. And then finally, I just wanted to hit on one more item procedurally. So the application was deemed sufficient for review. That's one of the steps in the early review process of the subdivision. It was deemed sufficient prior to adoption of the Situp-Kane Master Plan and Form-Based Code. And so this development kind of got in under the wire. This is the last of them. You might recall Remington Flats and Heron's Landing were also, they were in development and were deemed sufficient prior to adoption and implementation of the Plan and Form-Based Code as well. So, we're operating under the regular city subdivision regulations and also Title 20. And so some of the items that are not included in Title 20 that it would apply, and will apply to future development, are things like architectural standards, where structures have to be built on properties and that sort of thing. But both Title 20 and Situp-Kane Form-Based Code provide a menu of land uses that could occur on the property. And so they're not all that different. It's just that we won't be focusing on architectural type design. We don't have specific site plans for future development. So it's a little bit lower level of detail that you'll see at this stage, whereas in forthcoming developments, you'll see more detail at this stage. Next, please.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. So I'm going to be going through the annexation portion of this proposal, and then we'll circle back to the subdivision portion. So to start off, a petition was received from property owner Nate Tollefson for the annexation and zoning upon annexation of this parcel 8A of COS 6109. And as Dave mentioned, it's just north of the 44 Ranch and Flynn Ranch subdivisions that are within city limits, and then Remington Flats is to the west. So it's bordered on those sides by city boundaries. The parcel is located in Annexation Area A, which are areas identified in the annexation policy that largely meet the guidelines of the policy and are intended to be prioritized for annexation because they generally meet the factors identified in the annexation policy. And to go a little bit further into that, using the policy, we determine if the annexation request is aligned with the purpose and use criteria of the policy. And through this, we evaluate whether the annexation would contribute to the logical growth pattern of the city. So we look for if it's near these boundaries, if it's kind of filling gaps of previously annexed properties, whether the annexation meets current city standards around infrastructure and the provision of services and utilities, and whether the annexation complies with city plans and policies, including the goals of the growth policy and the city housing policy. And another part of staff evaluation is the criteria for zoning upon annexation. Per Title 20, as well as in Montana state law, the zoning upon annexation request must meet one of these three criteria. And in this case, staff determined that the request for a zoning upon annexation of B2-2 community business is consistent with C. So that's consistent with the land use and zoning recommendations for the subject areas as set forth in the growth policy. And I'll be elaborating on this in the next few slides. The Missoula 2035 growth policy designates the subject parcel as neighborhood mixed use. And it's also shown as being within the neighborhood, or sorry, excuse me, no development overlay, which is indicated by the red dashed oval on the map. Immediately to the south, the land is designated as residential medium, and that's where the 44 Ranch and Flynn Ranch subdivisions are. And I just want to mention that in addition to the annexation, staff also uses the growth policy to evaluate compatibility of the subdivision proposal. So the notes over the next two slides are relevant to both requests. Areas designated as neighborhood mixed use are intended to serve as visible and distinctive focal points for individual or small groupings of neighborhoods. Commercial uses in these areas include things like retail, offices, entertainment, professional services, eating and drinking establishments, and shopfront retail. And high density residential development is also encouraged in these areas. The relatable zoning districts of neighborhood mixed use include B1-1, B2-1, B2-2, which is the requested zoning today, and M1R2. So on top of that designation, the node development overlay is for areas that have been identified as prime candidates for concentrated mixed use and pedestrian friendly development that are also focal points for community gathering and transit. And the way it's described in the growth policy, these areas are envisioned to integrate office, retail, and residential, and be a spot that is a potential for transit-oriented development. So in addition to those designations, we also look at other relevant goals in other sections of the growth policy. And some of these include access to facilities, so access to green space and the multimodal transportation network, access to housing and a variety of housing types, as well as access to tools that allow for higher density residential development in appropriate areas. For example, a rezoning of land that would allow for multi-dwelling residential units. So these are all goals pulled out of different chapters of the growth policy. And then specifically for the annexation request, as I mentioned earlier, compliance with the city housing policy is a factor to consider for annexation. And the housing policy calls for equity in land use, meaning that every neighborhood in the city should share the responsibility of addressing the city's housing issues. And the plan also states that affordability is intrinsically tied to housing supply. Therefore, a proposal for a more compact pattern of development and density is supported by this plan. And so while the county land use designation is not technically part of staff evaluation, it's worth mentioning that the county has a similar designation for the property as community mixed use. And these areas, and there's a few shown on that map there, are identified for a mix of residential, commercial, and civic activity, as well as a higher intensity and variety of residential choices. So this is pretty similar to the neighborhood mixed use designation that we have in the city growth policy. The current zoning is, in the county, it's CRR1, which is a residential zoning district. And the recommended zoning is B2-2. And I'm going to go a little bit into what the B2-2 district allows. It permits a selection of residential, civic, and commercial uses. The types of residential buildings allowed include detached homes, duplexes, attached townhouses, multi-dwelling buildings, and mixed-use buildings. In the case of single-purpose residential buildings and mixed-use buildings, a minimum parcel area of 3,000 square feet is required, and a density of 1,000 square feet per dwelling unit, which comes out to around 43 dwelling units per acre. Setbacks apply in the B2-2 district only when a parcel directly abuts or shares frontage with a residentially zoned parcel. And in those cases, there's different situations where it either matches the setback of the residential district or it can be 50%. There's some footnotes in that table. And then the maximum height allowed is generally 50 feet. Again, unless it's directly abutting a residentially zoned parcel. And in those cases, the allowed height is 35 feet at the point of the required setback, if that applies. And the building height can increase by 1 foot for each 6 inches as it moves back away from that setback line up to a maximum of 50 feet. So a zoning upon annexation request is subject to the protest petition provisions outlined both in Title 20 and state law. A protest petition is considered valid when verified petitions are received from 25% or more of parcels within an 150-foot radius of the subject parcel that's subject to that change. If this 25% threshold is met, that means that approval of the zoning upon annexation requires a 2/3 majority vote of present city council members. So in this particular case, there are 29 properties within 150 feet of the Mcnet Flats property. And 8 petitions is the 25% threshold that we need to receive to meet that. And as of right now, there have been 12 petitions received. So I received one right before this presentation, so I need to update these numbers. But we have 12 total and 5 that are verified. And when I say verified, I mean they're within the 150-foot radius and are signed by all of the property owners that need to provide a signature. And back to you, Dave.
Thanks, Emily. So we'll talk about now moving into the subdivision in a little bit more detail. I'm going to go relatively quickly because we have a lot to cover today. But then as questions come up, either please feel free to interrupt counselors, or we can ask questions after if you have them. So in terms of the property itself, the topography is fairly mild. It was used as agricultural land historically. You can see the contours running through kind of the southern end of the property. Those represent a former channel of Grant Creek. So the Grant Creek, at least a portion of it, ran through the property at one point. It was rerouted, I believe it was in the 1950s. So the topography still shows it, but overall it's relatively flat. There are a few other pertinent features. Running right through the middle, north-south, is an 80-foot dedicated public right-of-way that exists today and was put into place several years ago. And that's where George Elmer is planning to continue up through the center of the property, eventually meeting with England Boulevard to the north. And of course, that connects with Mullen to the south. Along the southwestern boundary and continuing up the western boundary is an existing 60-foot private road and public utility easement. So that's there today. And then finally, on the east side of the property, the very eastern edge, is an existing irrigation ditch. And this historic irrigation ditch is in the Hellgate Valley Irrigation Company area. It provides property. It historically provided irrigation to the subject property as well as additional lands to the south. And that's proposed to be to be maintained within a 20-foot easement, and a culvert would line a portion of the ditch as well. Next slide, please, Emily. So moving on to the subdivision itself, some of the details. There are 7 lots. They're quite large for city lots because I think development over time on these lots is planned to be of varying character and fairly extensive. But 7 lots ranging in size from 1.15 acres to 3.05 acres. You can see that there's good connectivity that's planned. The existing roads, again, the George Elmer North-South, Old Ranch Road, that would connect to existing Old Ranch Road to the south and then continue up north through the property. You can see that to the west, both Winchester Drive and Remington Drive would connect with those 2 streets in the Remington Flats subdivision. And then Abbey Lane, which is the east-west road that you see running through the center of the property, that would connect to future development to the east. At this point, we don't have any, I haven't heard of any development proposals on the land to the east, but it's set up to provide good access and connectivity over time. I think the potential is there to connect Abbey Lane all the way over to toward Reserve to continue to the east, and so provide good access throughout the region. All of the streets are proposed to be lined with boulevards, sidewalks. You can see that there are bulb outs at the intersections that are kind of function as traffic control devices. In other words, they slow vehicle speeds down for pedestrian and bicyclists, and just kind of for safe travel. One thing I do want to point out to you is the northeastern, this is like the Remington Flats subdivision that we saw in the fall. There is a potential second runway at the airport. The airport's kind of thinking it through, and this subdivision, the northeastern corner, it's a good chunk of lot 3 in the northeast would be within an extended arrival and departure area if that runway comes to fruition at some point. And that's been addressed in a couple of conditions, recommended conditions at this point, to have statement notifying lot purchasers on the plat as well as in the covenants, which is how we handled it also in the Remington Flats subdivision. And then one more probably noteworthy point of physical infrastructure is along lots 5, the southern boundaries of lots 5 and lot 4, that's the southeastern ones, there is proposed to be an extension or a portion of the Tipperary Trail. And so this is another Mullen Build Project facility. It's a 10-foot wide paved trail that would actually come up all the way from Mullen through the Heron's Landing subdivision, up through Flynn Ranch, 44 Ranch, and then run east along the southern boundary of the property over to Hellgate School. So that's part of the plan. The developer would be responsible in this case for building that at the southern edge of this property. Next slide, please. So as you're aware, under Montana subdivision law, there are primary criteria that we have to assess. And so in the staff report is a fairly detailed assessment of each of the primary review criteria, impacts on agriculture, agricultural water user facilities, natural environments, public health and safety, etc. So I won't go into great detail on those. They're laid out, I think, in the staff report. But I did want to point out a few kind of noteworthy items for your consideration. With regard to agriculture and agricultural water user facilities, there is soil on the property. Actually, I think all the soil is classified as prime if irrigated. So that's a high quality soil, of course, that has been a subject of discussion in this and other subdivisions. Really, the whole area is considered prime if irrigated. However, the area is planned and zoned, both as Emily showed, both in the city and the county for higher density residential and mixed use type development. There are some irrigation facilities in the area and on the property, and those are proposed to be addressed so that offsite landowners can continue to utilize the water. Incidentally, there are no existing water rights that go with the subject property here today. In terms of natural environments, there aren't really public lands, critical wildlife habitats, significant impacts that we anticipate. I do want you to know that we did ask the developer to provide a study and do some research and analysis on the potential for stormwater to impact groundwater, and that impacted in a few different ways. One in terms of pollution, another in terms of what they're proposing to do, like much of Missoula, is provide stormwater catchments and infiltrate that slowly into the soils. And so we wanted to make sure there was enough separation between the bottom of those sumps and groundwater, even at high levels. And there is, according to the study that they provided, that's been given a nod of approval from our engineering folks, there's sufficient separation between groundwater and where the sumps would be, at the bottom of the sumps, even during 100-year type extreme events. In terms of public health and safety, that's of course one of the main things that we're looking at. We look at things like water supply, wastewater disposal, fire, police, streets, medical services, natural hazards, all those things. And in my view, the property checks out. In our view, the property checks out. There are no significant impacts that have come to light. Next slide. I can't see it yet, Emily. There we go.
Oh.
I've talked about local services a fair amount, really, in talking about the roads. But so that in subdivisions like this, the developer is required to build roads to city standards, unless there are variances that are granted, to provide sidewalks, boulevards, all the transportation facilities. I mentioned that the project is within the Mullen build area, and George Elmer is one of those roads. Also, I mentioned that there's an existing 80-foot right-of-way. The developer is proposing to provide an additional 5 feet on both sides of George Elmer for additional easement. It would be an easement for access and utilities if that street were ever to be expanded to require turn lanes and things like that. The developer is also being asked to, or would be required to, petition into the Missoula Urban Transportation District to include sidewalks, and I mentioned earlier the extension of Tipperary Way, that trail. So I think in terms of access, it meets all of our requirements. Next slide, Emily. We also looked at emergency services, police and fire. No concerns to date. There's a preliminary fire hydrant plan that was given a preliminary approval by DAX. Police didn't have any comments unique to the project. In terms of schools, the way that the development, the application addressed things like schools and traffic impacts, they assumed kind of what I'll call a worst case scenario, and that would be maximum number of residential units. They calculate up to 650 potential residential units that could be built on the site. That would be apartments. And so this is a good conservative way to do it, frankly, in my opinion, because it looks at what the maximum impacts could be. And so they looked at, estimated that there could be, based on household sizes in Missoula County, there could be a range of 250 to 300 school-aged children at any given point. We did seek comments from the school districts, but no comments were received. So I just wanted to point that out to you. In terms of parks, 3.07 acres of parkland is required to be dedicated because this could have, each of the lots could be developed residential. Emily, next slide, please. And so there are a couple of options for parkland dedication. There could be, the developers proposed a couple of options. One is just cash in lieu. And so I mentioned 3.07 acres is the requirement. And so cash in lieu is, I think, the express preference of the developer. And they mentioned at the planning board hearing roughly $250,000, $260,000 that could be used for park acquisition, development, and maintenance. Based on conversations with the city parks and recreation staff, we're proposing, and in part because of the character of the neighborhood, you've got single family type residential homes directly to the south. And so what we're proposing at the staff level is that there be a combination of cash in lieu and also land itself. And that the land would be along lots 5 and 4 along the southeast corner of the subdivision. So it would be kind of a linear park along the Tipperary Way trail. And it would also include the easement for the trail itself. The reason we're looking at only the eastern side and not the western side is because there's an existing, well, a couple of reasons. One, there's an existing 60-foot access and utility easement along that southern boundary of lot 6. I'm not sure that it'll stay there forever, but and because the area to the west of George Elmer is within a half mile of the 44 Ranch Park, which is considered a regional park. And so it's in the service area of that park based on our plans. To the east of George Elmer, because it'll be a collector, could be fast moving traffic, that's considered kind of a barrier. And it's also a little farther away. So Parks and Rec was supportive of the idea of both cash in lieu, but also requiring some land along Tipperary Trail on the eastern lots. Next slide, please. I must have a delay on my end. So moving into some of the intricacies of the subdivision, there are 6 variances that are requested. The first is our subdivision regulations require 90 feet of right-of-way for an urban collector, which is George Elmer in this case. And so the developer has requested an 80-foot right-of-way instead of 90. This is the same request that we heard on and granted on Heron's Landing. The developer has shown here in their plans that they can build out the street section in accordance with all of our requirements, including travel lanes, parking, boulevard, separated bike lane, and sidewalks. Again, this is we've done this previously, and then also an additional 5 feet of access and utility easement would be provided on both the east and the west sides of this road for expansion at some point in the future, should that become necessary. Okay, Emily. Finally got here. Okay, variance number 2 and 3. So in our subdivision regulations, we require 80 feet of right-of-way for urban local streets. And so all of the rest of the subdivision, or the streets in this subdivision, would be considered urban local. And the developer has requested 64 feet of right-of-way, which incidentally is a little bit larger. I think in the subdivision to the south, it's either 60 or 62 foot right-of-way for the existing streets. And the developer has also shown in the application that they can build a street meeting. That's okay. You can leave it. I've got such a delay. But anyway, I think we could. They proposed street sections that meet our requirements for construction in terms of travel lanes, parking, boulevard, sidewalks within a 64-foot wide right-of-way. And again, this is a variance that City Council granted in Remington Flats and also Heron's Landing to the south just within the last 6 months. Next, please. So variance 4 and 5 have to do with block length. You may recall that in our subdivision regulations, the maximum block length that's allowed is 480 feet. And this is kind of a peculiarity of the lot itself. Winchester Drive and Remington Drive coming in from, they're on the western boundary of the subdivision, serve Remington Flats. So we certainly want connection between those streets. And it ends up with some kind of funky looking lots that are a little bit, they're longer than they are wide. The northern lot 1 is about 609 feet wide. The lot to the south, about 627 feet wide, in order to kind of match up with the existing Winchester and Remington, and then also George Elmer to the east. In order to mitigate this issue, the idea of having shorter blocks is for walkability, basically to not have long expanses, but to provide cross and also connectivity so that they're cross streets, things like that. To mitigate this issue, the developer has proposed 10-foot easements, pedestrian type easements on both of the lots. The one to the south on lot 6 would connect to essentially an alleyway in the 44 Ranch subdivision. The one on lot 1 to the north would connect to potential future development. It's a farm field today, but could connect to whatever develops there at some point in the future. Next, please. I guess I probably need to speed it up a little bit. I know that this is it's a long presentation. So quickly, Pius Way is an existing city street. It's in a 54-foot right-of-way, and our subdivision regulations require that in situations like this, that the developer provide the full width. Well, they're proposing to maintain, they're asking for a variance from that standard, proposing to keep it at 54 feet, but currently Pius the driving surface is 26 feet wide. So the developer is proposing to improve Pius to have a 31-foot right-of-way, or sorry, 31-foot travel surface and parking area. So essentially make use of the existing drainage that's already on the lot, or sorry, on the street, but improve the width so that there's additional parking area and provides additional capacity. Next, please. There are 26 conditions of approval. Many of them are standard, but some are particularly noteworthy, have to do with, or unique, I should say, have to do with irrigation, participation in the mold build project. One thing I haven't talked about is along George Elmer in the 44 ranch subdivision to the south, there's an intersection with Cattle Drive, and there's proposed to be a roundabout. And that is, it's being designed currently, and all the developments in the area are required to contribute to that. So it's proposed to be built, or expected to be built actually, in either this year or next, so by 2022. So the developer would be required to participate in the cost of design and construction of that. And then really there are kind of standard conditions, dedicated city streets, boulevards, sidewalks, and I mentioned the commuter trail, Tipperary Way, petitioning into the urban transportation district, and then the parkland dedication. That's one that council will really have to consider is how they want to address parkland, whether it's going to be a combination of cash and lieu, all cash. So you'll have to think that through and then talk with the subdivider. Next, please. Planning board met and discussed this project in detail. There was really a healthy debate about the various elements. They had lots of questions about the process, about annexation versus subdivision and zoning, the timing of it all. Our answer was that this is really all happening concurrently, that council had already adopted a resolution of intent and it was moving forward kind of in one proceeding. There was also kind of frustration about the project not having to comply with the Setupcane master plan and form-based code. And I think probably the biggest concern that we heard from planning board members as well as the public is uncertainty as to what will be developed on the property itself, what will go on the lots. We don't have a lot of information on that today. And so I've asked the developer and his representative to address that to you in more detail. Also, there's a little bit concern, some of the people who live to the south were kind of hoping, I think, or at least they've expressed to us, they were hoping that just single family type or duplex type residential development would be located directly to the north, whereas the B22 district allows that type of development, but also allows for commercial uses. It allows for different types of residential, multifamily, et cetera. So questions along those types of comments and concerns. Next, please. But ultimately, the board did recommend approval by a 6-3 vote. And but they also wanted to address a couple of issues. This condition in particular, number 14, the motion was made and approved that Abbey Lane, again, that's the main east-west road, that because it could connect to the east, and this is also based on comments from our transportation folks in Public Works and Mobility, that it could become something like a collector over time, function like a collector, particularly if it continues east quite a ways. And so some protected bike lanes, an 80-foot right-of-way and protected bike lanes were appropriate. So essentially, there wouldn't be a variance granted for this for Abbey Lane, unlike the others. Next, please, Emily. And so this is the variance, number 3. So they did recommend approval of all the variances, including number 3, except they struck Abbey Lane. Essentially, that would still have an 80-foot right-of-way and would also have to acquire or include separated bike lanes. So I think that's where I'll end this presentation right now. But Emily and I are happy to answer any questions that you have, and I know that we'll hit on this next week as well. So there's some time.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dave and Emily. Appreciate the presentation. I do have a queue of folks lining up. I'm gonna try to get a sense here. I know we have members of the applicant team here. Can I, let's see, Cody or Matt, did you intend to do a developer presentation?
This is Cody Schwartz with Voith Engineering. We do have a quick presentation. We'll go through it quickly. Dave's presentation was pretty comprehensive, so we'll just hit on some of the highlights and get that done real quick for you. Okay, so the members of the committee with your hands up, can you hold your questions until after that? Okay, great. So Cody, go ahead and take it away. You should be able to share your screen and join by video if you'd like. Okay, we're joining by video here. Jordan, if you could allow Matt Hammerstein to share his screen, looks like he's already doing it. Yeah, Matt should be available or should be able to.
Screen that actually has the presentation on it.
Okay, we can see that.
Thanks, Jordan.
Council members, my name is Spencer Voith with Voith Engineering, joined here by Cody Schwartz and Matt Hammerstein. Like I said, we'll go through this pretty quickly. Dave's the city's presentation was very thorough, so there's a little bit of repetitive nature here. So we'll go through it quickly so we have time for questions. Next slide. So again, the location of Mcnet Flats, just north of 44 Ranch and Flint Ranch Subdivision, just east of Remington Flats. Next slide. So as part of the build grant, obviously the city did not get all the funding that they requested. The city did prioritize some of the funding in the build grant, and shown here in George Elmer and England Boulevard. Just want to be clear that those are two of the projects that did get funding based on the prioritization that was put forth through the planning process with the city and the county. The developer, Tolson Properties LLC, is locally based Missoula builder. The single family, multi-families, light commercial projects. It's been here for an extended number of years. He's been building for about 20 years in Missoula Valley. Next slide. Again, so the City of Missoula Growth Policy 2035, this area was designated as a node. The B2-2 Community Business Zoning District is a current relatable zoning district to the neighborhood mixed-use land designation in the growth policy. Next slide. Wanted to touch on the planning timeline a little bit. I know one of the big things that the planning board had mentioned was, the fact that this wasn't going through the new form-based code. Matt, if you can just kind of click through and get them all up there right now. So we're underneath the city growth policy, and that's because we were able to get the sufficiency review prior to the form-based code being adopted. And I don't want it to seem like we were rushing by any means to get in before that adoption was done. You can see up here that this parcel was originally listed in October of 2018. Our client began doing due diligence on it shortly thereafter. So this project has been kind of in the works, and we were looking to do annexation of the parcel, before the city had ever entered in with a contract with Dover Coal in 2020. So there's a lot of planning and process that went into this project, and it wasn't like a real, hey, let's get this done quick. Before that, it was just kind of where it fell when we started to work on this project. We can go to the next slide now.
Yep. So my name is Matt Hammerstein. I'm one of our staff civil engineers here at Voith Engineering. I think Dave did a pretty good job on going through the specific infrastructure improvements with this project, but I'll just walk you through those and touch on anything that Dave didn't hit. So as Dave mentioned, the subdivision includes 7 lots. Those are proposed to be zoned B2-2, and it's bisected by George Elmer Drive, which is the road that goes north to south right through the middle of the subdivision. Subdivision includes the public right-of-way design and construction, and that has the streets, the sidewalks, bike paths, landscaping, and the boulevards and the utilities included in it. The average lot size is 2.19 acres, and it totals 15.35 acres in developable lots. The maximum density for the lot area in B2-2 zoning would come out to about 650 residential and commercial spaces, and that depends on the future land uses within the subdivision. The B2-2 zoning would allow a variety of land uses, and that's to allow the developer to have some flexibility to accomplish two goals: creating an initial residential population in the area and maintaining capacity to establish potential commercial spaces as that population grows and that demand emerges in the area. You can see the arrangement of the subdivision on the screen. George Elmer Drive and Old Branch Road are the primary north to south roadways, and Abbey Lane is a local access street running east to west. Those two roads on the west side that kind of split off from Abbey Lane and dead end on the western boundary connect to Remington Flats to the west, and they're aligned with their two east-west roads in their development. So those proposed roadways, Dave did a pretty good job touching on this. George Elmer Drive, designated as an urban collector, and it has an existing 80-foot right-of-way. The developer proposes an additional 5-foot access and utility easement on each side. I'll touch on that a little bit later. George Elmer Drive will have 2 travel lanes, parallel parking on both sides, landscape boulevards with trees, asphalt bike paths, and concrete sidewalks. You can see on the rendering there, that's that intersection kind of right in the middle of the subdivision of George Elmer Drive and Abbey Lane. Those bike lanes are separated from the vehicle traffic, and they're located outside the curb line next to the sidewalks. A lot of places in Missoula, you kind of see those sandwiched in between the parking lane and the travel lane. And the idea here is to eliminate issues with vehicles parking in bike lanes, improving access for cyclists, and improving safety by keeping the cyclists away from vehicle traffic. So like we mentioned, George Elmer will have the additional 5-foot width on each side as a public access and utility easement. And that's just for maintenance of the sidewalks and the bike lanes and any additional utilities or infrastructure like bus stops or turn lanes that the city determines are needed in the future. The local streets within the subdivision will have a 64-foot wide right-of-way, and that includes 2 travel lanes, parking on both sides, boulevards, and sidewalks. And like Dave mentioned in his presentation, it's kind of something new in the city of Missoula. You don't see it a lot of places, but the development at each of the intersections will have those curb bulb outs. And those kind of just calm the traffic. They force drivers to slow down mentally as they approach the intersection, and adds a layer of safety for pedestrians and cyclists moving through the development. So closely intertwined with the design of the actual physical roadways is we have to analyze the traffic that'll utilize those roadways. And we did have a traffic impact study, and it was prepared by Bob Avelin of Avelin Traffic Services. And he determined that the maximum possible daily trips produced by the subdivision is 3,590. And Title 20 allows us to determine that maximum number just based on the maximum number of units that could be built on the lots. And that lets us gauge a true maximum impact to the transportation system, even if the exact buildings that are going to be on the lots are still somewhat uncertain. So that primary access is via George Elmer Drive, and the Mullen Build Grant improvements are expected to provide pretty substantial transportation improvements in the vicinity of the project. One of the big community concerns, both with Mcnet Flats and with other proposed developments in this area, is you can see it at the very south of the map there, that intersection of George Elmer Drive and Mullen Road. That intersection is planned to be improved to a roundabout within the next 2 construction seasons. So by the end of 2022, as it was prioritized in the build grant funding, and that funding is secured. In addition to that, like Dave mentioned, the traffic impact study identified that Mcnet Flats impacts the intersection of George Elmer Drive and Cattle Drive. And that's the main entrance to Flynn Ranch and 44 Ranch subdivisions to the south. You can see it, it's the circle on the map there, kind of directly in between Mcnet Flats and Heron's Landing. Longer term, there's plans for George Elmer Drive to connect to West Broadway. That is part of the build grant, but the funding for that portion has not been secured yet. There's only funding to extend George Elmer to England Boulevard and England Boulevard over to Flynn Lane. Mountain Line did comment on this project, and we also petitioned into the Missoula Urban Transportation District. According to Mountain Line, public transit in the area is not yet warranted, but they do support planning to provide that service in the future. So it's something that will come to the area, but the population to support a route just is not there yet. So we mentioned a little bit the build grant earlier, but just a little bit more detail about that and what is actually planned to be built within 2021 and 2022. So it's a concurrent separate city project, and it's being designed by DJ&A. They're another local civil engineering and land surveying firm. It'll provide pretty substantial transportation improvements in this area, and it'll support both Mcnet Flats and other projects that are coming online in the area. We worked pretty closely to coordinate the design of George Elmer Drive through the project with them, just to make sure everything is consistent with what they're proposing for that entire transportation corridor. And so you can see there on the map, the blue projects are what was prioritized for construction with the initial funding of the build grant. Those are set to begin construction this year. And it's pretty critical to ensuring that this area can handle the increased population from Mcnet Flats and the other projects in the vicinity. So we're a little bit less than 2 years out from all those prioritized projects shown in blue coming online. The city is still working to secure funding for the red projects, and they're looking at placing impact fees on development in the area to secure that sometime in the future. And I think actually in the coming weeks is when the council will be hearing and making a decision on that resolution. So those improvements mentioned a little bit. George Elmer Drive and Ingham Boulevard, those are the primary collector roads that are going to be built out this year and next year to serve the area. And the relationship between the timing of these improvements and the construction of Mcnet Flats is pretty understandably important. We'll touch on that a little bit more later. The Tipperary Way Trail, which Dave mentioned runs along the southern boundary of Mcnet Flats, was not prioritized in the build grant, but it will be built across the southern portion of Mcnet Flats. And that will allow at some future point when the parcel to the east is developed, that trail can extend further east to the school. So in addition to those surface improvements, Mcnet Flats includes the design and installation of public utilities in the streets. The subdivision will be served by extensions of the city of Missoula's public water and sanitary sewer systems. And similar to how we estimate the traffic, we use the maximum allowed density to design the water and sanitary sewer mains just to ensure that there's capacity both for Mcnet Flats and future development to the north. And that's based again on that theoretical maximum number of units from the lot areas and the Title 20 zoning. Stormwater runoff will be accommodated through infiltration, which is similar to how it's handled in much of the rest of the city. Like Dave mentioned, we contracted with Newfields Inc., they're a local environmental engineering firm, to put together a hydrogeologic evaluation of the impacts of that runoff to the groundwater in the vicinity of the project. And they found minimal impact both to the elevation of the groundwater and the nitrate concentrations beneath the site. Kind of to help with that a little bit, we are proposing the installation of bioretention basins at the street intersections. They go within the curb bulb outs, and you can see them on the renderings there. They're similar to what you see at Southgate Mall, but they're not employed yet on a large scale through the city. The purpose of the bioretention basins, like I said, it cleans the stormwater before it enters those dry wells and infiltrates into the ground, helps preserve the water quality a little bit above and beyond what a typical sump would do. They use native vegetation and organic soils to treat that runoff when it comes from the roadway. There's also an aesthetic benefit to them. You know, they look pretty nice out by the mall, so we're excited to see those installed and hopefully become more common throughout the city in the coming years. I'll hand it over to Cody here.
Touch back on the parklands. Dave mentioned that our preferred route would be the cash and lieu donation to support existing parks and potentially purchase new land for new parks. That value is estimated at $257,000. We'd also be providing the dedication of the easement along the southern boundary east of George Elmer for the Tipperary Whale Trail. The other thing that we have proposed to the city that wasn't quite required by any of our subdivision process is to install a protected crossing at George Elmer Drive. Similar to the gas station out on Mullen, there's a crossing there for the bike trail. You know, we're trying to direct everyone to that trail throughout our project and have a safe crossing of that collector street, George Elmer. You know, we're only about 0.4 miles from 44 Ranch Park, which is city-owned park, and it's a great place for kids to go and play. And then we also have that conservation easement that's highlighted here, that's just southeast of our property. Not certain what any of the plans are for that conservation easement. We're just kind of showing some of the open space that's in the area. But as I said, we're really looking for that cash in lieu, because we feel like we can give that safety of crossing George Elmer, and it also just allows a lot more flexibility for those lots in the future to be what they need to be based on what the market dictates. At this time, we don't have a complete site plan for the entire parcel. We've talked about that, and we'll get to that again here in a minute with Spencer. But our reasoning for wanting this cash in lieu is it allows a lot of flexibility so that different aspects can be on those lots, whether it be multifamily or they be commercial or mixed use or different land uses. So Matt, you can hit the next slide now.
Cody, I'm just checking on time. How many more slides do you have?
We've got about 3 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Be pretty quick here. Bicycle travel. This was the other one that was mentioned by planning board, was to add a protected bike lane on Abbey Lane. You can see we have a maximum of 2,000 vehicles per day figured. According to the National Association of City Transportation Officials, bicycle lanes are most applicable when volumes exceed 3,000 vehicles per day. And again, we think that Tippery Way Trail on the south is a better conduit for bicyclists. And we have connectivity to our sidewalks, and we can try and direct people down to the south and use that protected crossing of George Elmer rather than adding new bike lanes on Abbey Lane that might not be as safe for the public. Next slide. This is the quick development timeline. Matt, if you can click through them all real quick. You know, this is very similar to what Matt already discussed. Potential initial occupancy of Mcnet Flats wouldn't be until 2022, which would be when that first phase of build grant construction has been completed. Final occupancy of Mcnet Flats is going to be determined by the pace of design, permitting, and construction of private developments on each lot, and just the market demand more than anything. Next slide, Matt.
So in closing, we feel Mcnet Flats represents the beginnings of a new place within our city, envisioned in 2 subsequent planning efforts, both the Missoula 2035 and the more recent Sutup King area master plan. Mcnet Flats provides a subdivision that can meet the goals of the planning efforts with an initial concentration on creating residential density to support the planned community node at the intersection of George Elmer and England Boulevard. Both planning efforts share a similar vision in Mr. Carlson's property, an efficient mixture of residential and commercial spaces as a substantial portion of our city's growth in the coming years. Our Missoula 2035 envisions Mcnet Flats as part of the neighborhood mixed-use district, providing up to 650 residential and commercial spaces. Sutup King area master plan places Mcnet Flats in a community-centered district, providing as many as 540 residential and commercial spaces. Commercial services inevitably will come to the Sutup King area, but their appearance is dependent on the creation of an initial residential population to support a market for community businesses. Ultimately, Mcnet Flats is an opportunity to create a catalyst for growth in the fledgling region of our city. Mcnet Flats will provide flexibility for projects to create the initial residential population while maintaining capacity to establish commercial spaces as demand emerges. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have very little time left in the scheduled meeting, and I want to remind everyone that this is the first of a series of 4 meetings, and so we're not going to get to everyone today. We're not going to get to all of the questions today. We'll get through some questions and some public comment. I do need to. I might be able to let us go a couple of minutes extra, but with our sanitizing and procedures in the council chambers, we need to end fairly promptly. We have another committee meeting that's also time constrained right after this. So with that in mind, please keep your questions brief. What we may do is just get some questions onto the record and then get answers at a later time. And we'll just kind of take that on a case-by-case basis. So first of all, I have Heather and then Julie.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks for the presentation. I think most of us are always concerned about a couple of different topics. One is what are our desired outcomes from our housing policy and how is the developer going to reach those desired outcomes? And the second, for me in particular, is around traffic, and I'm sure my colleagues have some others. So Cody or Matt, I'm wondering if you could just speak to what does your client have envisioned in terms of trying to meet our need for this community in bringing more housing to the market? What kind of numbers are we looking at?
Hi, Heather, this is Cody Swartz. The initial phase, one lot, I'm guessing we will be going straight to multifamily to provide, a severely lacking service to the community. Right now, we've got about a 0.5% vacancy rate for apartment units. So that's all I know for right now is, one lot's most likely going to be a multifamily. And then as we move through and we see how the market changes and fluctuates as this is constructed, there could be a variable product coming online.
All right, so to just clarify, this is going to be primarily rental versus home ownership opportunities. Is that correct?
I don't know for all of the lots. The first lot would most likely be rental.
Rental for lot one? Okay. All right. And maybe for our next meeting, you can come back hopefully with more of a concrete answer on that, to that question. And then my second question comes back to traffic. And Dave, I think this is more of a question for you and other staff. When I think about how do we make housing affordable, we want to make sure that as we build, we are very conscientious in terms of cost. And every time that we have a wide street, we know that is really expensive. So I know we have urban collector streets and urban local streets that carry different levels of traffic. And, we have recommendations, but then we also have these variance requests. In particular with Abbey Lane running east-west, which is just, if I remember correctly, 1 block north of Tipperary Way Trail. Was there some conversation in that planning board meeting about the absolute need for having an additional bike facility that does add more cost as well as adds more impervious surface area to that particular parcel?
So it wasn't a staff recommended motion. We recommended approval of the variance that would have had a 64-foot wide right of way and not the separated bike paths, but it was something that the planning board discussed. And it was, I think, based initially on a staff comments, one of the comments from our transportation folks that was submitted in early stage of this review. And they suggested that, although it's unclear exactly what's going to happen to the east of the property, that Abbey Lane could function kind of like a collector in the future. And so it may be safer to provide off-street bike facilities, I think for safety and also for maybe energy conservation, if I remember the conversation right. So I haven't followed up with our staff on that, and I can certainly do that, get their thoughts for the meeting next week if you'd like.
Yeah, Dave, let's do that. Let's get comments for next week on that from Transportation Division.
Appreciate that. That's all of my questions.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Julie, and then Amber.
Maybe my questions are dumb, but I'm looking at this, a couple of these lots are fairly large. Is there an anticipation that there's going to be a further applications on these lots, like further subdivision or perhaps an application for a TED development? Or are we just assuming that these are going to get built out based on the size that they're at right now? Does that make any sense, Dave? Maybe you can help me out.
That makes perfect sense. All of the above are potential outcomes. They could be further subdivided. There could be a TED. There could be simply be on one of the lots, an apartment type complex or multifamily housing type complex. I think it's really kind of wide open. And I think that's been what's maybe a little bit disconcerting for some of the planning board members and some members of the public is that the outcomes, Cody has said, at a minimum, at least one of the lots right off the bat is very likely to contain multifamily housing, but we really don't know what the outcomes will be on the others. I guess the only answer I can say to address that is, we do have zoning in place. We have engineering requirements. We have requirements for parking and setbacks and other things that also come into play upon development. Now, we don't have all the answers today as to what the development might look like, but there are kind of safeguards. I don't know, not everyone will be happy all the time, but there are processes in place to ensure that development on those lots complies with city rules for lots of different subjects.
Real quick follow-up, if I may, Jordan.
Go ahead, Julie.
If one of these lots goes through a subdivision or a TED development, will they then be subject to the subtupcane plan and the form-based code? Or is that ship totally sailed?
I think the ship has sailed unless they seek to develop in accordance with that plan.
Thank you. Amber and then Heidi.
I've got a few questions, but I'll just ask one today and then send the rest. Emily or Dave, could you just do a quick highlight? I'm sorry if I missed this, between the B2-2 zoning that's proposed and what the current zoning is. You said they're similar, but are there any things that need to be highlighted in the difference there? Height, density, things.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify the similarities are between the land use designations. So neighborhood mixed use and community mixed use. I honestly am not too familiar with the CRR1 district. I want to say it's 1 dwelling unit per acre. So, I mean, that is a pretty sizable difference between 43 dwelling units per acre. And CRR1 is definitely a primarily residential county zoning district, whereas B2-2 is intended for units. I'm not sure the details of like setbacks and height that would be allowed right now in the CRR1 district, but I can get that information.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Heidi.
So I had a question way back on the slide that showed the topography and an old channel for Grant Creek, and I'm not expecting an answer right now. I know that as a part of the build grant, there was a discussion of remediating the Grant Creek corridor, and I was just wondering, I realized that part didn't get funded, but where that remediated channel would fall in comparison to this property if it isn't in the historical channel. So thank you.
That property, so the Grant Creek channel as it is right now, that's proposed for restoration as part of the build project, is located to the north and west. So closer to the airport from this.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, there's no one else in the speaker list. I have several questions myself about a variety of issues. And I'm sure several of you do. I have questions about some of the neighborhood comments on snow storage and some questions around buffering and transitions. I think that I've said this several times in other meetings, but I think that there are oftentimes some concerns when there's a hard edge between one type of development and another. And so I have some questions along those lines. What I'm going to do is write up my questions and submit them and hope to use those next week, but I'll get them to you, Dave and Emily, in advance, and we can go from there. I have one member of the public, I believe it's Mr. Hancock, with a public comment, and I have one more council question. Stacy, do you want to go ahead, and then we'll go to some public comments?
Great. I don't expect an answer for this. I just want to flag for our next time that we talk about this. I'd like to hear a little bit more from Parks about, some of the options. realize that there is still some vagueness around what this ultimately is going to be built out to, but it does allow for quite a bit if they utilize at maximum density to feed into that 44 Ranch Park. And so I'm curious to know when they designed that, the capacity use it was intended for, and how this potential development, if built out to the maximum capacity, affects that, and then somewhat of our options. So wanted to put that on the radar for our next time. Thank you.
Thanks. And I will, like I said, I know that there are many questions. I will be happy to collate those and get them to staff if people want to send them to me, or if you want to send questions directly to Dave and Emily, and we'll go from there. Final council comment before we go to public comment, Mirta.
Thank you. I had many questions that I already submitted to staff, and maybe we can touch on those at the next meeting. Chief among them is some sense of predictability from the developer's part to alleviate the concerns of the neighborhood. But I also would like to request that we allocate more time than 1 hour or 2 for the next meeting, because I know there are many little issues, particularly those that were brought up during the planning board meeting, that I think would be worth it for us to have a conversation about. Thanks.
Yeah, and that was our intent this week. There was a miscommunication on timing, and so we will have much more time next week. And I think this introduction, will serve as a great opportunity for folks to think about the project and come up with questions. So we're going to go to public comment. I ask that folks keep the comments brief and to information that hasn't already been submitted to the extent that it's practical. Again, this is one opportunity of many to comment. I believe it's Mr. Hancock. Can you hear me, and are you able to speak?
Yes, thank you, Jordan. I just want to touch, in the interest of time, only on one of several topics, and that is to remind council about the history of the Tipperary Trail. Unfortunately, the Mullen Build team acknowledged that the trail was denied access to build it along Tipperary Trail. Clearly, this meeting tells you that an alternative plan has come up along the southern boundary of the Mcnet property adjacent to Pius Way. But the land east of Mcnet is in limbo. It's a 270-acre property, and it's been for sale since July 2019 for over $28 million. No right-of-way has been granted to connect the trail from Mcnet to either Flynn Lane or Hellgate Elementary. As Matt points out, Mcnet is willing to build a portion of the trail, but your position should be clear. Do not build a trail that may sit idle for years and give a tax credit until an eastern right-of-way is granted with a construction timeline. Otherwise, you have built a trail to potentially nowhere. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Would anyone, there's 2 other attendees, Ms. Ortega, and then a phone number. If the phone participant would like to participate, just press *9 on your phone. If anyone else would like to participate, feel free to use the hand raise function. Okay, so our phone participant would like to participate. So you are, our phone participant is in the meeting now, and you should be able to press, I believe, *6 to unmute your phone. Oh, our phone participant has disappeared from the meeting, it looks like. Okay, well, again, we'll have multiple opportunities to comment, and there will be, and our voicemail box, 406-552-6012, is another way to provide phone comment. Any additional comment before we adjourn for now? Okay. Like I said, we'll have this back after the public hearing, and thank you, everyone, for your time today, and we will be adjourned.